Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a conversation today. Whoever's joining in to a conversation about Watership Down, a novel by Richard Adams that a few of us are here to discuss and talk about what it means for us to be the church and how this novel might be important for all of us as Christians. I'm joined this morning by a couple of friends, and I'll let them introduce themselves. But first of all, I just want to say my name is Parker Haynes. I'm the pastor of St. Timothy United Methodist Church in Brevard, North Carolina. My friend Tim Best and we went to seminary together, and he's joining me. He's a pastor in the Holston Conference. He's in Knoxville. And Tim, can you just say a brief word of introduction about yourself?
Yeah, I'm the pastor at St. Paul United Methodist Church in the Fountain City neighborhood of Knoxville. And Parker and I think it's really important, Parker, that everyone knows that we went to Duke, that you went to Duke. I just want to stress that to all of your Tar Heel friends. And I went to Emory and Henry College and graduated in 2011. And I took a class there in the spring of 2010, I think, Christian faith and literature. I like books. I like reading. And I was a religion major, so I needed some religion classes. And so I took a class by Dr. Joe Rife, Christian faith and literature, and we read this book that I had never encountered before, Watership Down. And anyhow, that's how I know the book and how I know Joe Rife from Emory and Henry. And I have been serving in Holston since we graduated seminary in 2014. And literature, certainly this book, kind of chief amongst the books and other pieces of literature I've read, has kind of stayed with me in ministry. And so I'm excited to have this conversation and to introduce kind of hand it off, I guess, to Dr. Joe Rife, who I still kind of see as an expert of this book and kind of a guide in this story. Certainly has been a great conversation partner for me, and that class really shaped the way that I read a lot of things, read literature probably as a whole. So do you want to say a little bit about yourself, Joe?
Sure. So yes, I am Joe Rife. I would be remiss, since we've got these two Duke guys here, if I did not point out that I'm a 1980 graduate of Emory University's Candler School of Theology. I was and I'm an ordained United Methodist minister. I was a pastor in Mississippi for 5 years, and then returned to Emory and did a PhD, and have been teaching at Emory and Henry since 1990. And actually, I'm retiring at the end of this semester. I don't know that I'm all that much of an expert on Watership Down, except that I've read it a whole bunch of times because I've taught that course 8 or 10 times. And I decided from the beginning, when I first taught it in, I think, about 2007, that I wanted to include Watership Down, which has always been a favorite of my books, but I should certainly give credit where credit is due. And one of the main reasons I included the book was because of Stanley Hauerwas's essay on the book in his Community of Character, which was published in the late 1980s. Yes. So that's why I got onto this.
Do we need to do kind of an overview of the story, like a very short synopsis? Do you want to do that, Joe, or would you like me to?
Well, I'd certainly like some help from you all. Well, it starts, and I think it's important to say that one of the things that Adams says, I think in the preface to the 2005 edition, I can't remember, is that it's a book about rabbits, and so the rabbits are communicating with each other using language that we can understand, although he creates a kind of Lapine language with my favorite, I think, is the word for an engine or a motor, which is hru-doo-doo, so cars and all of that. But it's a story of a group of rabbits in one warren who are they call themselves outskirters, so they're kind of marginalized in this warren. They're young, and they decide to leave this warren, mainly because Fiver, one of the rabbits, has had this vision. He's sort of the mystic in the novel, has had this vision of absolute danger and destruction, blood running in the field and all of that. And eventually, that after they've left, that vision comes true. But so then the book becomes the story of their journey. I agree with Parker. It's a book about community. I think it's also a book about home, and I think that's what, and searching for home. And I think that's one of the reasons why kids can relate to it so well, because these rabbits leave their home, the only home they've ever known, and they're searching for a new home. And part of that search is led by Fiver's continuing sort of visions about where they're supposed to go, although they resist his visions at first. And they come to another warren. They have all sorts of dangers along the way. We'll probably get into some of that, but they come to another warren and they want to stay there, but Fiver ultimately decides it's a terrible place and they can't understand why. And eventually it becomes clear why it's a terrible place. And so then they set off and find Watership Down, which is up on a ridge and is a sort of perfect place for them to establish a new warren. But then, of course, the problem becomes that I think they start out from the Sandalford Warren, where they had originally lived, with 11 rabbits, and they pick up one along the way. A couple of others eventually join them, but then the issue is all of those rabbits are male, and they're not going to last very long if they don't have some female rabbits. And so then that becomes the drama of the last part of the book, and they get 2 female rabbits from a nearby farm, hutch rabbits, sort of domesticated rabbits, but then they also get some other rabbits from another warren, which is about 3 or 4 miles away from them. And that's a sort of story in itself, and there's all sorts of conflict and danger.
Yeah. So they encounter, like, I think it would, there are kind of a diversity of rabbits amongst the group that sets out. Strong ones, big ones, weak ones, smart ones. You know, they have kind of different strengths and weaknesses, and you encounter in these warrens different values. They value different things about the rabbits. So, and you kind of see that even in how physically the rabbits present themselves. So you have the warren they come from, then the next warren, which is maybe philosophical isn't the kind of right way to put it, but there's a whole lot that could be said about that next warren. But certainly they're kind of fatalist, and they're willing to get fat and just kind of wait for the end of the line.
And they're individualistic. That they, you know, to use Hauerwas's terms, I think they reflect pretty much everything that he slams about the Enlightenment.
That's right.
Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, and then you have this, you know, this next warren where they do get more females, more does, kind of in the end, which is, you know, the real confrontation is with this, you know, militaristic kind of strong state sort of community, right? Like,
led by a true dictator.
Totalitarian, basically, right?
Yeah. So other than, and I think all 3 of us could probably, you know, again, Parker has that book. I have my copy of the Hauerwas Reader at my office, which is where I have time to time returned to that same essay. And so I think that essay will probably be in the background the whole time we're talking. But I guess at the end of the day, I think what's really intriguing is why would adults care at all about a book about rabbits? Uh, like, what's intriguing?
And I guess I could just say before we hear about that, this is kind of a chain of reaction. So, Tim, you read the book first in that class, and I first heard about the book from you in seminary. And I guess that was kind of my first reaction was, what are you talking, like a novel about a bunch of rabbits? Like, why would I be interested in reading that? What in the world does that have to do with Christianity and being a Christian and anything? And then I read the book a couple of years ago, and I started to unravel some of that. But then it wasn't until I read Hauerwas's article that I really understood how important and significant it was. So I do think that question is important.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I know this is the edition that we used in that class 10 years ago. And in the beginning of this, I think this is like a 2005 edition. And in the introduction, Adams talks about how his children encouraged him to write this story. That's an interesting story about how long it took him, kind of the formation of the narrative. But when he originally took it to publishers, they were like, who's this for? Is it for kids? I mean, this thing is not a short, I mean, it's a novel. Like, is it for kids? It's too thick for kids. It's about rabbits, so it can't be for adults. So, yeah, I mean, there's that kind of, it's an odd book. So why rabbits? Joe, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Well, there's lots of different ways that I could respond. This is one of my all-time favorite novels. But I think I'm going to borrow some language from a colleague of mine at Emory and Henry, Robin Reed, who has been retired for a few years now. He's an English professor. His specialty was Renaissance literature. Spenser's Faerie Queene was, I think, what he did his dissertation on. But right before he retired, he did one of these last lecture things, and it was about books. And one of the things that he included, which I asked him to share with me, was a list of what he called nourishing ingredients of a book. And he listed 4, and I'll list them briefly and just say that I think Watership Down fits all 4 of these. He says the book would include a remarkably comprehensive variety of complex characters. No question, Watership Down has that. A second potent ingredient is the book's dense carpet of allusions, and, you know, wow, all over the place. A third exciting ingredient is richness of style, and I think Adams really wrote the book very well. His characterization, for instance, is fascinating. Lots of great characters. And then also he says, Robin says, a fourth valuable ingredient, rarely found in most books, is a truly comprehensive plot with many radically different strands that engage in a pointedly meaningful interplay. A plot, moreover, that is teasingly suspenseful, yet finally inevitable, giving us the challenging and satisfying ending that is missing even in many of the best books. Check that off too. So, you know, to me and I guess maybe as I was teaching the book over the years, so I was an English major in college, was a big Faulkner fan, and you know, Faulkner had this image about how he created Yoknapatawpha County based on his home base in North Mississippi as a kind of little postage stamp of soil where he could sort of deal with all sorts of deep human issues, and I think we've got that going on in this book too. So those are some reasons why I think everyone should read it.
Well, let me ask you this: is it for kids or is it for adults?
Well, I think it's both. I read this book to my son when he was about 8. He absolutely loved it. Um, my we have 3 grandchildren, all from one of our children, and our son-in-law has read the book to 2 of the 3 kids. The oldest one, I gave him a copy of the book, and he still hasn't read it. He's 15 now, and I keep badgering him to read it. So I'm hoping eventually he'll give in. So I think it's both, and I think that's another reason why it's a great book, that I think it can appeal to everyone.
Yeah, I think that depth, and I'm trying to remember all of those 4 ingredients, but a good story is a good story, right? And a good story connects with people, and kind of across ages, and that the depth of illusion is certainly present. And I think there are probably different pieces that connect with children from the story better than adults, and then pieces that fit with adults better than children. Parker, do you have any questions?
For people who haven't read the book, first of all, read the book, but it like what we're saying is a story about rabbits, but it's a story about community. And it tells, it's a fascinating portrayal of the way, of what composes communities, of how they're made up, of the individual characters, but also the holistic nature. And is a fascinating, as I reflect on this novel, some of the truth that it has to speak to modern society and community, and some of the issues and kind of failures that we're experiencing today. I mean, this book, I think, was it written in the 70s?
Yeah, published in 72.
Yeah. But it's even more true today, I think. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on just the theme of community and the way that the book is able to draw some of those themes out, and what that means for you.
So, Parker, your question was about story, right?
Well, I mean, community and story together, right? I think narrative, what defines a community, what kind of community.
So they're going through these adventures, and they meet these different challenges, some that we've named, some we haven't. And what do, Joe, when they face a challenge?
They tell stories.
Yeah.
That's one of the things they do. I mean, sometimes they have to fight, sometimes, whatever. But that they tell stories. And in fact, the very first story that they tell is in the middle of the night, on the first night that they've left their original warren, and it's kind of a rabbit creation myth, in effect. With the Frith is the sun, and it's sort of a sun god. And creation, and one of the many echoes, I think, of scripture comes in that story, where El-Ra, who's the kind of the rabbit hero, is hiding from Frith, and because Frith's wanted to give a gift to each of the animals. More complicated than that, but and Frith finds El-Ra, and he's sort of stuck his head into a hole, and all that's pointing out is his back end. And it's a little bit like God in the garden saying, "Where are you?" That sort of thing. But so the Frith ends up giving El-Ra the rabbit gift, which is their strong hind legs, which allows them to run fast, and etc. And that story comes at a particularly opportune time, because these rabbits are scared and doubting very seriously what they're doing. And so the stories tend to remind them of who they are, or some aspect of their character, both as rabbits and as a community, I think.
Yeah. And I think that's helpful, that the stories remind them of who they are, as individual rabbits, but as a community of rabbits, and kind of not always directly. Sometimes you kind of see it later, but this is how story plays out, right? Like you tell a story to a child today, a story, we don't always, I hope at least, stories don't always have this very clear moral to the story, right? Hopefully, because in my opinion, good literature is better than just the moral of the story is,
Right.
Especially for kids. Often they hear a good story and even for adults, and then later it kind of seeps in and shapes us. And this is kind of what is happening with the rabbits, right? They're in a pickle and they're like, oh, what's a good story we know? As we're resting here, I think it's raining in that first story. And then they go to, this first warren they reach. It's a place without a story, right?
Right.
And they don't want to hear any stories. You have this weird poem that's not really a poem. It's just this weird non-story.
But it's kind of an expression of the most fatalistic aspects of Stoicism, for instance.
Yeah,
that's one way to read it.
So what are some of the good and bad, the pro and cons of these different communities, these different warrens? Because, even the warren we were just talking about, the individualistic warren, like there are things that we would lift up as like, well, actually that seems pretty great. Like being able to not have to rely on one another so much, being more independent, not having to rely on that old hocus pocus kind of stories that seem made up. And in the other warren, the kind of totalitarian warren, there's protection and there's benefit in that too. Whereas when they get to Watership Down eventually in the end, that there's significant danger. So can you draw out some of the, obviously the benefit, but then some of the drawbacks between these different communities of warrens?
Well, I think it's fair to say that before, so Howard Ross wrote his article in the mid to late 80s on Watership Down. So the book had been out 15 years or so. It's my understanding that one of the primary ways the book was interpreted, and still is interpreted for years, is as kind of an allegory about different types of political organization and leadership. So that the sort of standard interpretation is that Sandalford, their original warren that they leave, is kind of this traditionalist place where, the example there is that once Fiver has his apocalyptic vision about impending destruction, Hazel takes him to see the chief rabbit of Sandalford, and he doesn't listen to them at all, because to him they're nobodies, and so why should we pay attention to them? And that of course ends up being the undoing of the warren. And although it's more complicated than that, it would have been very difficult for that warren to have just picked up and moved, even though they needed to do so, according to Fiver's vision. The warren of the snares, or cowslips warren, the first place that the traveling rabbits encounter, is basically a warren that has given up its wildness because there's a man who owns a farm near there, and he basically brings food for them every morning. But then it's called the Warren of the Snares because then whenever he wants some nice roast rabbit for supper or whatever, he sets a snare or two and catches them. And what's developed in that warren is the idea that you never ask the question, where is somebody? Because the rabbits are disappearing and nobody wants to deal with that reality. And this, of course, is ultimately Fiver, once the other rabbits finally realize, the Watership Down rabbits, once they finally realize the problem there, Fiver sort of offers them a story about that warren, which sort of spells all this out pretty clearly. And so leadership basically there is kind of every rabbit for themselves, except that the leaders, one of the main tasks of leaders is to make these strange new rabbits keep quiet about what's happening.
Some observations, even as you're kind of about leadership, from just the first two, is the Thrira, the name of the leader of the first warren, of the Sandalford Warren. His job seems to be kind of maintain the status quo. Mm-hmm. Clearly, like what I remember, the main argument of, well, no, we can't leave because we've built everything here. Right. We have holes, we have safety, we have the economy of the warren to worry about. We just, it would destroy what we expect, like what we have come to enjoy about our life together. And the next one is, again, like the one job of the leader is to make sure that questions aren't asked. Well, so then they go on, and there's this, I think there's this other dynamic is how leadership develops in the Watership Down warren, because when they set off, there's this question in the air of who is the head rabbit, who's the chief rabbit here, and that question doesn't really get truly answered. I think, at least in my mind, when I listen or read the story, it doesn't get answered until much later in the story. There's still a little bit of ambiguity. Maybe, maybe this rabbit, Hazel, who becomes the leader, he's the one that kind of leads this expedition, but he's not the strongest, right?
Right. Bigwig is the strongest.
Yeah, Bigwig is clearly the strongest, the bravest rabbit. And they use those kind of expectations of strength equals leadership against this other warren that they come to encounter, which values strength above all else, brute strength.
Yeah, this is the dictatorial.
This is Woundwart's. Woundwart is the leader.
Ephrafa is the name.
Yeah, Ephrafa. That's right. And they arrive. They encounter these rabbits, and there are patrols, strict patrols. The holes are hidden, unlike any of the other warrens. You have the first warren is this kind of free, sort of, open system. Like the rabbits were able to leave without too much hassle, but kind of the don't come back sort of expectation. They certainly had the idea is kind of they committed some sort of treason to leave, like bad taste, at least, for them to leave.
Well, it's bad for them to leave because the more rabbits they have in that warren, the better your survival odds. Because of, you're talking about Cowslip's warren, right?
No, I'm talking about the Sandalford warren.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And the Cowslip's warren, that's Cowslip's warren wants them there because the more people, the more rabbits kind of contributing to the system. So if the more individuals there are, your odds increase of living longer. And so they want to fold them in so that kind of everybody does just a little bit better. Your odds go up. But it's again approaching it from, how do I as an individual, I want other individuals to come in so that I might live a little bit longer. And then you have Ephrafa, which is, we are one unit, and if one of us leaves, we're all in jeopardy. And so no one can leave. If you want to leave, you're brutally punished, if not worse. And to the extent this leads to the kind of violence between the two Warrens at the end. And, you know, Woundwort, even in the end, cannot accept a reality that doesn't demand kind of this totalitarian response. And I think it's helpful to remember that Adams is a veteran of the intelligence service, right?
It was in World War II.
For World War II, for the British. And some of his characters, he even claims, are shaped by folks that he encountered in the service. And so you have, and this is something Parker brought up the other day, one of the many themes at play in this book is strangers and hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was gonna get into that, because I do think that's an interesting theme, because hospitality and welcoming are, especially for Christians, are ancient virtues. And it's interesting to see the experience that these different rabbits have in these different these different warrens. And actually, like, so we might think of that first warren, Cowslip's warren, it seems on the surface much more hospitable and welcoming, especially versus the second warren that they encounter. But actually, there's not really any kind of thick hospitality or welcoming that's genuinely offered in either one, in which the rabbits are welcomed for who they are and for the gifts that they bring, and listened to for their unique voice and perspective. You don't really experience that. You know, they're either used for something, especially in Ephrathah. You know, their bodies are important to be there, you know, and they have tasks and duties in this kind of almost utilitarian approach to it. But it seems like with the main, you know, group led by Hazel, throughout the novel, there's just this very genuine respect, or at least it grows, especially, right? It's not always there at the beginning, but by the end of the novel, you see Bigwig and Fiver and Hazel and all of them, they all understand the genuine gifts each rabbit brings, and that how they are different, and yet they are held together in common. And that allows them to respect one another for who they are, and the gifts that they bring, and the differences. And it's able for them to build this very unique community, this kind of thick community, in which they're able to be, you know, they don't have to be violent towards one another. One another's not a threat. It's just an amazing, I just find that amazing, in which hospitality and welcoming the stranger actually develops them into a really interesting kind of community.
Yeah, and this gives me an opportunity to there are so many different echoes of the biblical story in this book, and one of those is you kind of get this picture of Hazel as a sort of a Moses figure. He's leading them, especially I guess it's the second night that they're away from their home warren, where you get this sort of murmuring in the wilderness thing. Some of the rabbits start complaining to Hazel and others, you know, why? I mean, you know, they don't say it this way, but weren't there enough graves in Egypt that you know? I mean, it almost becomes that way. And Hazel, you know, just starts sort of encouraging them to keep going. And by the end of that night, when they get out of the heather, it's right before they encounter Cowslip's warren, some of the rabbits say, "Oh, that Hazel, what a chief rabbit he is." You know, I mean, that's sort of his first leadership test. Mm-hmm. But another example of this, and what you were referring to a minute ago, I think there's also a great echo of 1 Corinthians 12, when the last morning that they are there at the Warren of the Snares, and Bigwig, the strongest rabbit, gets caught in a snare, they manage to get him out, and the only way they're able to do that is that the two smallest, weakest rabbits in the group are able to get down in the hole and gnaw through the peg to release him. And that to me is just a wonderful illustration of the weakest element of the community is the most important in some way.
What I love about those two rabbits, because is it Blackberry and Fiver?
The two smallest ones are Fiver and Pipkin.
Pipkin.
Yeah.
But you see these Blackberry's the intelligent, kind of creative one.
Yeah, he's the one that kind of is able to think outside the box, I think.
Yeah, and so like I think about how these rabbits, it's also helpful to remember that it's kind of their first night, I guess. They're trying to cross this river, and who's slowing them down, right? These same two rabbits.
The small ones, yeah.
Small ones that they had to be helped across the river. And there are these other points in the story where you see, they couldn't have done this without Bigwig. They couldn't have done it without Pipkin, or they couldn't have done it without Fiver or Blackberry. Like all of these gifts that they contribute, and then Hazel as the leader who helps them see how they can fit together.
And who also is willing to acknowledge and recognizes the gifts of even the weakest ones, and says that, articulates that after the fact for the whole community.
Yeah, which is leadership.
Yeah.
And even kind of a willingness to recognize his weakness and to take responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Before we move away from the hospitality, I think one of the best examples of how hospitality is both important and helps them is really two examples. Is Kahar, the seagull,
mm-hmm.
and
injured seagull,
injured. They help nurse this giant bird, back to health. They have to take care of, kind of even keeping his space clean, right? If I'm remembering rightly. And then this field mouse. Is it a field mouse? Am I remembering this right? That these acts of hospitality, these outsiders. So it's one thing to say, hospitality to strange rabbits, but they're actually engaging with other creatures, the total other, that could be a threat. I mean, this is a bird, and again, before they get to Cowslip's Warren, there's this story of this bird that, I think it's a crow maybe, that tries to attack them in the field, and they can't. They're struggling to find cover, and so that they then welcome in a bird, which we've already seen. This is dangerous. That sort of hospitality is something that I think maybe as we kind of maybe shortly we can kind of draw connections between our world and hospitality. But these actions of hospitality end up helping them in the end and creating a truly kind of prosperous community for them. And I don't mean just wealth prosperous, but like a thriving community.
A flourishing.
Yeah, that's right.
And some of the rabbits are very much against helping the seagull, the animal. I mean, they do see it as a threat and a danger, and they're not sure. And yet I think it's Hazel who is kind of like, well, let's just see what happens, and it ends up really great in the end. Like the enemy so-called becomes a blessing to them, but only because they have the patience and the imagination to see it come to that.
Yeah, and I would add, this may be a little bit of a stretch, but it seems to me that one could even draw an analogy between those interspecies interactions and something like interreligious dialogue. I mean, I think, for instance, I think that Bigwig in particular is fascinated by Kahar the seagull, and he just learns all kinds of interesting things from him, because, and it's clear Bigwig's not going to become a seagull, but he knows he can learn things from Kihar.
He can become a better rabbit by learning certain things from the seagull.
Which is interesting because Bigwig is kind of the rabbit of rabbits, right? Like he's, this is kind of what is loved about Bigwig. He's everything that the Ephrafa Warren and General Woonwort like value about being a rabbit. This is a rabbit. He's strong. He's powerful.
He's a good fighter.
Good fighter. He's a rabbit's rabbit. Where the others, these weaker ones, those are the ones that you do away with because you just let them drown in the first act rather than save them. And so it's really telling that this kind of super rabbit Bigwig is one of the ones who really connects and kind of is fascinated by this stranger. And I think, there are a lot of connections, interreligious dialogue, interracial relationship.
Connected with that, Hazel helps the field mouse at one point, and none of the other rabbits understand why he does that. And Hazel doesn't necessarily see it as, oh, we're going to get some use out of this mouse. He does it because, it's kind of a looking out for the weak, standing up for the weak or whatever, protecting the mouse from the kestrel, the predatory bird, another bird as enemy, and then eventually it is because of the mouse that they are able to prepare better for the invasion of the rabbits from Ephrafa. But I mean, Hazel had he couldn't foresee that.
So when you see the other as good in and of themselves, just good for so to speak as a Christian, that God creates in a person or creates creation, and that creation's good. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to prove its goodness, right? Which I think could then spin into a great conversation about how do we, as the church, advocate for the differently abled and all sorts of for children,
for immigrants.
So the possibilities are just endless. That when you begin from a place of the other is good. We start from this kind of assumption that the other is good, and then later we can discover that the other may actually have something to teach us, and that teaching can benefit us. And I think that's just really important.
I want to circle back to what Joe was talking about a second ago with Hazel, because I think another one of the themes that Watership Down draws out that I learned from it was about leadership. We've already talked about leadership a little bit. But it's interesting the way in which Hazel, and also Fiver and maybe some other characters, the kind of caricature that I at least tend to associate with the leader, or Fiver. Would you say Fiver is kind of like a prophetic figure in the novel?
Yeah, prophetic figure, mystic. I mean, he goes into these trances occasionally. So I think I think he's sort of a mixed, a prophetic, yes, to an extent, but also he has a kind of second sight that the other rabbits don't have.
Right. But when I tend to think of a prophet, or if you stick to Hazel's case, being the leader, you tend to think, okay, a leader needs to be strong. A leader needs to know what he's going to do. A leader must be courageous and all of these kinds of things. And yet Hazel really maybe doesn't really start out as a leader, but definitely by the end of the novel is a leader. And it's based on all of these very situational context-driven decisions that he makes along the way that form him into a leader. And it's a very different portrayal of leadership than I think that we tend to think of today. But it offers me a lot of hope of how, making decisions and leading other people. A lot of it is not, a lot of it just kind of comes throughout the natural course of life, and being formed and making decisions. So I don't know. I'd be interested to hear your take on leadership in Watership Down and Hazel, and the different leaders and how that plays out.
Well, a couple of things to say about Hazel. One is he is willing to take criticism. He does not, very different from Wound War to, it's my way or the highway. He recognizes the gifts in other members of the community, and when there is a particular problem that they are facing, he has an uncanny ability to seek help from the member of the community or the members of the community that have the most appropriate gifts. He asks for help. He does not expect the group to kowtow to him and to brown nose him or whatever. He's so I think all of those are, and he has a kind of self-critical, he has an ability to criticize himself, which clearly Wound War does not have. Clearly the Thrira and the Sandalford Warren does not have. So I think all of those are great examples of Hazel's leadership.
And one of the other things that Tim and I talked about earlier, sorry, I'll be brief, Tim, and then you can jump in, but we talked a little bit about courage, and, courage is a virtue, and yet its virtues are a middle position between two extremes. And so it's interesting because, Bigwig at certain times might seem courageous because he wants to run into a situation and just use his brute strength and take over. And that seems like courage. And then the opposite of courage, obviously cowardice, is, weakness or whatever. But Hazel actually emerges as the truly courageous figure and leader, because it's not cowardice and it's not recklessness, just running into a situation. It's navigating that and finding a way to come out of that together as a community. And that's another thing I learned just about courage and leadership. Tim, you were going to say something. I cut you off.
Yeah, no. That's I think that's all really good. One of the things that as we're talking about the Warrens and then leadership, that's kind of developing in my mind as we're talking is all of these, both the individual leaders and the Warrens, maybe that they represent, all kind of can be seen through this lens of how they respond to fear, right? How they respond to particular dangers and particular fears, and what sort of community does it produce? So their reactions to certain understandings of what are dangers in the world shape their communities and shape their leadership and then shape their communities. And so you have each of these kind of reacting to the fears that they see in the world, maybe not even really the real fears. Like, I think there could be there's an argument to be made that Ephrathah has created a fearful reality that just isn't true. I mean, some of those dangers are there, but they're reacting to a story of the world that just isn't true. And maybe that can be said of these other, like all of these other Warrens, that they're responding to their perception of the world that they're not seeing fully, they're not seeing rightly. I think there's a lot more that could be done there, but maybe even just kind of talking about fear. how do we as communities respond to fear shapes how the sort of community we are. I don't know what sort of, again, I'm just kind of shaping that in my mind as we're talking. I don't know what responses you all have.
And Parker, I'm glad you introduced the Aristotelian mean related to virtue. It's another good example of Hazel being able to take criticism is there is one place in the story where he is a bit reckless, and that's in trying to get the does from the farm. And Fiber is, Fiber really goes after, Fiber and Hazel are brothers from the same litter. And Fiber really accuses him of showboating and trying to, to show off or whatever. And it almost leads to Hazel's death. But once again, Hazel ultimately is willing to say, yes, you're right, I was wrong. I put us at risk. They do successfully get 2 does from that venture, but Hazel almost dies.
We all tell stories for a living. I mean, I think the stories kind of differently than certainly in different ways for a professor and for pastors, but you are ordained, you have preached, you continue to preach some, right, Joe?
Yeah.
We, at the end of the day, kind of a big part of what we do is we tell a story. I would argue that even, especially as a professor, you're telling a story, and you're helping people read and understand stories. So I think those are really critical skills. This is why I value the sort of education that we all kind of share, that we need to kind of be able to read the world, right? And a willingness to kind of read the world. And I think that we get help when we read literature, good books. And this is certainly, we agree, this is a good book. But, using some of the framework that we get from stories to help us kind of make sense of the world is kind of part of what it means to be human, I think. One of the ways we make sense of our world. So Parker keeps alluding, I keep alluding to kind of reading this in light of Hauerwas's essay, which he's kind of trying to make this story accessible for the church, for communities of Christians. And, we're doing this, not just doing it on Zoom, but we're doing this conversation because we find ourselves locked up in our homes, kind of bored. And, although I'm sure all 3 of us have plenty to do, we also have plenty of time to kind of sit around and think about and talk about this story. So we're experiencing a crisis in the global community. And so I've been thinking about this story in how does the church respond to a crisis? Because, these rabbits respond to different crises throughout the book. What are some ways that each of you maybe have allowed this story to shape how we're kind of reading our present moment? I don't know if that's open enough for you all, but I think there's a lot that could be said here, right?
Yes, well, one thing that I immediately think of in relation to Watership Down is there are at least 2 points in the story where Hazel, as a leader, basically says, we're not leaving these weaker folks or these, members of the community behind. The first one we've already alluded to, the first stream that they come to, and one or the other of you mentioned that they could have just left the weak rabbits behind, but they don't. The other is when they're making their getaway from Ephrathah, and they figured out how to use the boat to go down the river and get away. And all of the rabbits, including the however many does they got from Ephraim, are on the boat except for one member of the community. I think it's a dandelion. And Bigwig is saying, you know, we got to go. They're closing in. And Hazel says, not without Dandelion. We're not leaving without him. And to me, I mean, the most obvious analogy to our current situation is to be quite skeptical and even critical of the suggestions we're hearing that it's okay for some people to die in order to restart our economy, for instance. I mean, it's much more, you know, that's much more complicated than the way I presented it, but it's, to me, is one good analogy there.
Yeah. Parker, you have something?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the things that Hauerwas draws out, so I recognize like not everyone has read this essay that Hauerwas wrote on Watership Down, but, you know, the last few years, this reading and other reading that I've done have really helped me be able to see the world and the different communities and narratives and stories that make up, you know, modern life. And it seems like, you know, a couple of those stories at least are a story kind of nationalism, that our identity is rooted in the nation state in which we find ourselves. Another story we might name as like the global market or capitalism, or of this kind of commodification of every aspect of life and creation. And in some ways, we're seeing these right now in the pandemic. I mean, so for us, especially in America, where, you know, the economy is really important, money's really important. The economy is driving decisions. We want to be in control of this situation, right? And I think control is very much a part of this. Like, we want to be able to control what's happening. We want to control the virus, right? We want to control the economy. There are examples, I won't name countries, but examples of countries like the totalitarian Warren in the world that care a lot about image and different things. What does it mean for us? I mean, I think for Christians, one of the things that Hauerwas says is we can acknowledge we're not in control. Like, we don't get to control what happens in the world. We recognize that there's evil in the world. And for us, it's not as much about, you know, securing our nation or the economy or any of these things. It's really about faithfulness. And that seems to be a connection that Hazel and their group of rabbits, you know, from the time they leave Sandalford, they're not in control of their surroundings or what happens in the narrative. They just encounter things and have to improvise. And that seems like the position of Christians in the world today. And that gives us a freedom, it seems like. So
and they tell their story. They remember their story throughout, which kind of encourages them. And in somewhat, like at different points, gives them even ideas of what they need to do. I mean, Hazel in the end. So I think that story you shared, Joe, about them being at the boat and waiting for Dandelion, they're ready to, you know, some may be ready to sacrifice Dandelion, right? And it's not long after this that a kind of a willingness to sacrifice happens. Like it has to, you know, but Hazel makes that choice as the leader.
Right.
So I think in the church, and this is again something else that Hauerwas, maybe in a lecture I sat in on one time, or maybe in some of his readings, his writings that I've read, said, you know, his prayer for the church is that 100 years from now, we'll be known as the community that values both our young and our old. And, you know, I think we're in this moment where it's kind of testing. And I see a lot of anxiety. Folks are like, well, what about the folks who've lost their jobs? How do we, you know, we got to get back to work because these people need, they need help. They need money. They're going to
part
start.
of what I meant by this. It was more complicated than the way I presented it.
Yeah. Well, but I think the way you present it is helpful in that one of the things I think that, again, just like these different Warrens can kind of tell a very simple story and they kind of ignore the others, the needs of others. And I think, the reality is that our stories, I think a lot of our stories we like to tell ourselves are kind of being exposed. The way that this story, when Bigwig gets caught in the trap at Cowslip's Warren, the story that they've everything's great. We got abundance of food. These rabbits are the biggest rabbits, the fattest rabbits that we've seen. They can just eat all the time, anything they want.
This is the life for us. Yeah.
This is the life. Yeah. That story gets exposed when Bigwig gets caught in the trap. And I think a lot of our stories, and this is why people are struggling, because with saying, we have to open up right now, because, well, the story that you just have to put in, work hard, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, like that story, what I have, and maybe this isn't generous, but what I've been kind of referring to in my mind, the libertarian story is being exposed, that we're not, like, libertarianism can't get us out of the situation that we're in. I just think it's shown that it's like Cowslip's Warren. Eventually everybody's going to die, and they're going to be eaten. They're all going to be sacrificed in the end. You kind of convince yourself that it won't happen. And so I think there is this exposing, and as the church, I think it's important to recognize in that story you're telling of Dandelion is the idea isn't that we're all going to make it out alive, right? Like, that's not the goal. Isn't some sort of naive reality, like naive magic kingdom that we create, like, everyone's going to be safe, no one's ever going to get hurt. Like, that's a lie too.
Right.
But there may be those who have to, sacrifices will be made, but and I think I see Parker's crucifix on the back wall of his office, and for us, that self-giving of, like, that self-sacrificing, that's kind of, the cross is our understanding of leadership, right? I think of, was it Heizenreiter or someone that taught at Duke that was famous for saying, what the German word for leader is, right? Führer, kind of pushing against the narratives of leadership that are really dominant. We just need one strong leader. And I think all political parties in our country are kind of guilty of this. If we just elect the right person, president,
Well, we overvalue presidential leadership, for instance. So something that I was reminded of as you were talking is another illustration of all this in our current crisis is how clear it has become that many of the least valued workers in our economy, we are depending on them now in ways that we didn't realize. Grocery store employees, certainly healthcare workers, and that is that's reminded us of the importance of a broad range of gifts that we don't always acknowledge.
Yeah.
And we might be able to, like, if you think about Cowslip's Warren, like, some of us might be able to get fat and eat a lot and have plenty of food, but others of us are going to suffer. And that seems to be the trade-off that people are trying to make now. It's like, well, it's kind of a utilitarian argument that I think ultimately fails. And the other thing, Tim, to what you were talking about, we also tend to elect leaders, like, I hear a lot recently about, policy and how policy is ultimately what matters. And there's no mention anymore of character and having a leader who has character. And that's the difference I find, like, in the Watership Down novel, is that Hazel is a leader who, he didn't have any policies at the beginning that said, oh, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and you should elect me leader. But he has the kind of character that when they run into Cowslips Warren and Ephrathah, that he can make the decisions to help them out of it. Not because he has some great policies he's thought of, but because he has the kind of character. And that kind of conversation and language is so lacking with any modern leaders today. It's all about policy and decisions and kind of libertarian policy or whatever, socialist policy, but it's not about character and who the kind of person is.
And as Joe pointed out, Hazel's character develops through the story.
Mm-hmm.
So, character's also not this fixed point on the map either.
Right.
Character can develop and it can diminish. And I think part of what helps it either way is, either, kind of remembering your key stories and also kind of this openness to reflect on your character and to allow, when your runt brother says, you really screwed up, Hazel, this was really bad. And I tried to tell you beforehand it was bad. That could be a moment where character diminishes as much as it was a moment where character grew in Hazel. And, again, I think fundamentally this story, one, it's just a great story, but it's helpful for us to read, and those of us who are leaders, and all three of us serve in leadership capacity, to recognize that we don't have all the tools, and we can never have all the tools. But our character, part of it is our character, is recognizing that other people do, and how important it is.
I think Parker mentioned the improvisational character of Hazel's leadership earlier. Doesn't Sam Wells have a book on, what is the title of it? Something improvisation.
I have it. Okay.
Well, no, it's okay. I know he uses that image, and
improv.
So, I think that I'm indebted to Parker for pointing that out, because I'm not sure I've ever thought of it in quite that way. But the connection I want to make here between that and the Hauerwas essay, for instance, I think Hauerwas makes some arguments in that essay about tradition, the Christian story, etc. And part of the problem that so many folks have found with tradition is that they think of tradition as this thing that's set in stone and totally inflexible. But one of the ways to see the novel is, on the one hand, they tell their stories, those stories form them as individuals and as a community. But on the other hand, they don't see that set of tradition as some set in stone thing that they can't improvise on. And I don't know if that's I don't know if that's the way Wells uses that metaphor, but to me, that's meaningful in thinking about this book and its connection to life in the world and in the church.
Yeah. Hauerwas has a great line where he says that I don't know if it's related to tradition, but he talks about doing the same thing over and over again, because he talks a lot about discipline and habit and things like that and how that forms you. But he says, but you can't actually ever do the same thing over and over again, because the world is always changing around you. So even when you're doing the same thing over and over again, you're actually doing something very different because your context has changed.
One of the things, do you mind if I jump in, Parker?
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that you bringing that back up, Joe, reminded me of, as I was thinking about it yesterday, is Alistair McIntyre's kind of discussion of, which is, again, he looms large and for Wells and for Hauerwas and so many of the rest of us, but his kind of definition of tradition and kind of living tradition. And I thought of how the story ends, how Watership Down ends, and they're kind of all playing in the sunshine. And what Hazel has done at the end, like what kind of Hazel's last, it may even be something, Hazel's last stand or something like that, maybe the chapter. But they're kind of, they're retelling the story now to their young rabbits, and it's not Hazel.
Right.
It's El Rey Ra. The story is then enfolded into the tradition, that what the community has encountered now becomes a part of that tradition. So it's not this, a lot of folks, and I think part of this is, still wrestling with the legacy of the Enlightenment, this tradition bad, anything tradition. Right. And so tradition often seems stale for people. And as you're kind of getting at, Parker, like that's not the case. You're never doing the same thing twice. And it's great to see, the ending of the book is kind of this example of tradition is growing, it's developing. That, they've told these stories of El Rey Ra, but even those stories aren't fixed. And just like in the church, we have scripture and we tell those stories, but we also have a lot that has happened since scripture that, because, I would argue, because we believe in a living God, a Trinitarian God, those stories are really, they're witnesses too of what God is doing in the world. Mm-hmm. And so we fold those stories into the tradition.
I was blessed to be taught by Bill Mallard at Candler, a wonderful historical theologian, may he rest in peace. And one of his standard sort of interpretive devices was to talk about the capital S story in Christian tradition and the little s story, our individual stories. And one of the ways that he talked about that was that the capital S story is not over. It is continually being formed, and our little s stories contribute to that. So Tim's example of what the rabbits do with their exploits as they form the next generation into their stories is a good example of that.
Yeah, and I want to give, and I told Parker this the other day, I want to give an example of kind of really the need for story, the pastoral need for story that I have seen, many years ago now, or many may be an exaggeration, but when I first entered into ministry, I got roped into assisting with a funeral for someone there was no connection with before and really no connection with afterward. And I was not the main, I didn't really even deliver a sermon, but I helped kind of lead the worship service. And it was really obvious that the grieving family, had no story of which to kind of make sense of. Like, they didn't really have the tools to make sense of the death of, someone in their 70s who died kind of a natural death, but they still didn't have the tools to wrestle with that in some helpful ways. And so a granddaughter, young, late teens, early 20s, got up in front of the small group of family and friends and began to kind of eulogize, but used primarily lyrics. She said, I'm writing a poem. It's a poem to grandma, but using lyrics from country music songs, from like pop, like not like folk music, like, which I think, not the country music stuff that you and I like, Joe, but like, this pop stuff kind of ain't going down till the sun can't come up sort of thing. And use these lines. It was pretty obvious what was kind of being pitched as an original song, original poem, was a mashup of a whole bunch of the stories that this person kind of lived their life by, which was country music that plays on the popular radio. And it served to me as a reminder that we all have stories that shape us. We all have these lines. We look for rhythms to help us kind of name our reality. And maybe it's a prayer from the Book of Common Prayer, or the Book of Worship, or maybe it's music we heard on the radio. But we all kind of grasp at language, and that's a whole direction that we could go. We don't have time for, to kind of pull in Wittgenstein and, you know, all this idea of language. But we have these sources of language, these stories that we pull from. And in moments like this, we figure out whether those stories are worth what we've paid for them.
Yeah, we are a story-formed people. Some stories are better than others. I mean, that's vintage Hauerwas. But you were talking earlier about preaching, and I think, to me, the best preachers that I've ever heard are preachers, both women and men, who are good storytellers and who are able to fire the imaginations of their listeners in such a way, you know, that the listener, you know, says in their heart and in their mind, I want to be a part of that story. You know, and this is part of the reason why I love Watership Down, because it is, I think it is very easy to identify with the characters, even though they are rabbits.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of a good place for us to kind of find our soft landing. That I think a good book, and Watership Down fitting this bill. When I was an exchange student, I spent several months at like 2 or 3 months at the beach with my host family, and I spoke some Portuguese, but
this was in Brazil, right?
This is in Brazil. Believe it or not, you can only spend so much of your time surfing every day, especially when you're an uncoordinated, large Midwesterner. You know, you got to fill your day with some other things. So I had finally finished the Lord of the Rings trilogy when I was there. And I remember wanting to cry. I'm like, the story's not over. Like, there's more coming. But the book's done. And then just a few years later, the last Harry Potter book came out, and both good stories. No one get me wrong that I enjoy Harry Potter. It's a fun story. But when we got to the end and they're on the platform at the end of the story, I'm like, yeah, this is how it's supposed to end. Like, the emotional response from a book, say Watership Down or Lord of the Rings for me, you know, was so moving, where I'm like, this is a story that I want to live in this story. And Harry Potter, I'm like, this was fun. This was a good 10 years of my life spent reading this story as they came out, right? Like, I was in middle school when they started coming out, and finished them as a young adult. And so I'm like, this was good. You know, I've read a couple of the Harry Potter books since, but I have Watership Down. I have read twice, maybe. I've listened to 3 or 4 times on audiobook in 10 years. So, you know, I think a good story does draw us in and connects us, you know, heart and soul to the story. And then we take that story with us out into the world as we kind of read the world then. So,
any other final thoughts, Joe, from you?
I think I've pretty well said everything. One of the things I used to do on, I think, the second day of class with this book was I gave the students this list of scripture passages, and because there are just so, and I do love the thing that Adam says in the 2005 introduction, where he says, I want to emphasize that Watership Down was never intended to be some sort of allegory or parable. It is simply the story about rabbits made up and told in the car. Well, you know, my response to that is, okay, but when you set a story loose on the world, you've lost control of it. And I think he is being a little modest there. I mean, his knowledge both of biblical story and of sort of classical mythology, funds that book in so many fascinating ways that it it's so that rich carpet of allusions is fascinating to me.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for your time, and great to talk to you, Joe, for the first time, and encourage everyone to read the book, Watership Down, and hopefully have some similar thoughts to us. And thanks for joining us.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah.